there. Welcome everyone to our inaugural SSV Brown Bag event on all the things behind smart surfaces. And for the record, smart surfaces are not about countertops and floors. They are about trees, tree canopy, and cool roofs, and cool roads, green roofs, stormwater, bioswales, all those kinds of fun green infrastructure stuff. So just an update on this. This is the warming stripes kind of information, and it's updated now for 2021, and it doesn't tell a happy tale. The far right corner is kind of the Anthropocene, and those red bars show a very from basically shows a tale of the industrial age, and why we do what we do, because things are definitely picking up in terms of global heat. Just a word about Sustainable Silicon Valley. We are a very nonprofit think and do tank, and you can read the rest, but those basically get into the areas that we get into. Jennifer Thompson's the executive director. I'm the Water and Sustainable Life Director, and I'm on the bottom there. And we basically are action words, in terms of connecting, inspiring, and impacting. By the way, this is an example of agrivoltaics. They're growing between solar farms. The shade is beneficial for a lot of plants, and there's a lot of opportunity to combine solar power with agriculture, which is a kind of a new thing. Wet Talks and our Brown Bag series is sponsored by Cargill. Cargill has there's a link here, and I'll be putting all these links in the chat and sending chat afterwards. So, but they have an interesting story about their water priorities, the CEO mandate, the Water Resilience Coalition. A couple housekeeping notes. As I mentioned, I'll be putting a number of links in the chat, and monitoring chat and Q&A. Preferably questions. Our preference is Q&A, but we look at the chat too. And there is a chance, depending on questions, of overtime. We talked about this 11 to noon. We might go over depending on a amount of questions. Want to mention too, the preliminary wet talk with Greg Katz and Greg Spots is available as video, and it talked more about the kind of smart surfaces idea and a bit more general stuff, and then Greg Spots talked about what he's doing with the city of LA. Lately, he was picking up ticker tape from the Super Bowl parade. He said, a great parade needs great street maintenance. So, but anyway, that video is at this link here. We will now talk about Jackson Becce. He's a project manager at Smart Surfaces Coalition and has been a research analyst. He's the co-author of the Smart Surfaces Coalition Stockton Report, and was involved in the report for Baltimore as well. He's also kind of the keeper of the model. In just academically, he was involved in kind of the intersection of spatial elements, environmental, international, economic, and equity, which is reflected, I think, in very much in this this event. So, by the way, there are tiny Earl things around here as well for the Stockton Report, and also a new document that we just put up about strengthening American infrastructure with smart surfaces. So I will now turn it over to Mr. Becce.
Great. Great. Well, thank you, Dennis, for having me. And thank you, everyone, for letting me speak here today about smart surfaces and the Stockton Report, which we'll get into in a sec. As Dennis said, I'm a project manager. My name's Jackson. And I've been with the coalition for about almost a year now. So we'll get into the agenda. Today, I really want to talk about kind of why the way cities are developed the way they are, and why the Smart Surfaces Coalition was formed specifically to address that issue. Then we'll go into smart services, defining them, providing some examples. And then I want to spend the bulk of the presentation kind of showing the math behind the Stockton Report, the methodology behind the quantifications that the coalition does, and then some time finding the money, so to speak, looking at California specific policies, but also federal policies in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and elsewhere in the federal government, to provide the funding necessary for local governments to adopt smart services. And then if we have time, I'd love to demonstrate the SSC cost benefit analytic engine, as I think everyone would get a lot out of that. So we start here with, the status quo of urban development. For as long as I can remember, the way that cities have been developed has been overwhelmingly using, as you can see with this aerial image, with dark and impervious surfaces. So dark and impervious roads, and you can see, the roads, streets, parking lots, and roofs all are very dark in color, and thus will absorb most of the solar radiation coming in. And in the summertime, this will lead the city to be on average 8 to 12 degrees hotter, an effect known as urban heat island effect, which, as I'm sure most of you are aware, coupled with imperviousness and the likelihood of runoff polluting nearby waterways and leading to adverse health effects. The way that cities have been developed has been really damaging in terms of protecting low-income populations, protecting the health of all of our populations, and just making the city overall more livable. So right now, the current solution to this strategy and method of urban design has been to implement more air conditioners. And while air conditioning is certainly an equitable and short-term effective solution, it is woefully insufficient in the long and medium term in terms of cooling. So when you put air conditioners in a house, yes, you are cooling that house, but running electricity is creating emissions. Also, when you have air conditioning units stacked on top of each other in multi-storied buildings, the actual leakage from air conditioners on the bottom will diminish the efficiency of air conditioners directly atop of it. So air conditioners, again, are an effective solution, but maybe not the long-term solution that we need. So when we think, how do we make our city service decisions smarter? This is the image that I want to put in everyone's mind. You could see the overall color of the aerial image is just more reflective and light. So a lot of that incoming solar radiation is being reflected back into the air. That'll reduce, electricity bills. It'll reduce ambient temperatures in the city. Coupled with things like greenery, bioswales, green roofs, and trees. Now we're looking at an approach that simultaneously addresses water and heat at the same time. And kind of the reason that this slide does not look like this slide is really because of this. And it's the way that surfacing decisions are made at the city level. City agencies that handle infrastructure decisions and specifically surfacing decisions only look at lowest first cost as a factor for making these decisions. As a result, they don't have the expertise, the tools, or necessarily the authority to quantify impacts like other impacts that cities care about, like heat, air quality, tourism, economic opportunity, et cetera. So what the Smart Surfaces Coalition is a cohort of over 40 plus organizations that cities already work with, who quantify the impact of these different surface options, both in terms of the cost and benefits, to give local governments the ability to make evidence-based surface decisions so that we don't focus on lowest first cost, dark and impervious surfaces. Now we're looking at the lifetime of a surface, and taking in a bunch of those external benefits like health and tourism that I discussed. So this is just kind of showing you the scope and the breadth of our steering committee and kind of who's leading the coalition. So just something to note, the coalition steering committee ranges from the CEO of the World Cement Association to the executive director of the American Public Health Association. So we really try to work with every facet of engagement at the city level. So the coalition has come together to implement smart surfaces across the US and across the world. So at its most simplest form, what is a smart surface? It is any surface that more effectively manages two issues, sunlight and rainfall, than the standard dark and impervious conventional option that has characterized cities, for the past how many decades. So these two pictures on the bottom are actually from Greg Spots, who spoke at the last Wet Talk. One of his phases of cooling, where he is, laying down over 200 city blocks of reflective coating in LA in different neighborhoods. So, a dark and impervious pavement will, lead to excess rain runoff, will, absorb a lot of that solar radiation, and it'll oftentimes lead to cracking and thus reduced pavement life. The reflective coating has an extended pavement life. It's reflecting heat back up, thus reducing, ambient air temperatures. And then when you couple that with things like bioswales and trees, again, you have that water retaining element to the strategy. So overall, these are just kind of like what smart surfaces are in terms of examples. So we see the reflective green and porous surfaces. We also include trees and solar PV. And then probably perhaps the most important part of the slide is the bottom right, the combined solutions, because, throughout California, there are reflective roofs, there are porous pavements, there's a ton of solar, obviously. But what there's not a lot of is these integrated holistic strategies. So, when you deploy a bifacial solar panel over a reflective roof, the cost of implementation goes down for each technology, while the efficiency of the panel will actually increase due to that light being reflected off the reflective roof back into the panel's surface. So, those are just kind of example of when you integrate these solutions and combine them, and then take that to a city scale, they become really compelling in terms of financials, but also in terms of impact. So, now that we covered smart services in the coalition, I just want to focus on the smart services for Stockton report. And kind of more broadly, the report focused on Stockton because it was positioned in California's hot, dry climate. It also has, obviously intense summer heat, but also some flooding issues and a lot of equity challenges between North and South Stockton that I think were representative to analyze, so that now cities in the hot, dry climate, whether that is in California or throughout the rest of the world, can say, these results applied to Stockton, they can apply to us too. So the methodology behind the report is actually quite simple. At first, in order to work with a city, the coalition needs a high level of engagement from the city's government, and specifically access to data. So right here, we see Stockton's surface coverage breakdown on the left side with an aerial image of Stockton on the right side. And this was provided by the city, but what it essentially allows us to do is say, what are the surfaces that Stockton is made of, and what interventions can we make to these existing surfaces to provide, obviously, like health and equity and tourism benefits, et cetera, to the city. Some things to note specifically for Stockton: the residential steep slope roofs, and steep slope roofs are often residential, though commercial roofs can also be steep slope. And the majority of commercial roofs are low slope, though again, some commercial roofs can be steep slope. But the majority of Stockton is made up from these steep slope roofs, which are much more difficult to apply reflective roofs and solar PV onto them than the low slope option. So this is just kind of important to know before we get into the analysis. And then one other thing I'll notice is the trees make up 10% of Stockton surface coverage. There's actually about 33% left out, and that can be attributed to other. Other in this case represents vacant lots, packed dirt, the services that are not on this list, obviously, but still comprise the city area. So once we've taken these surface coverages in Stockton, then we form an adoption scenario. And what that means is essentially we work with the city. In Stockton, we looked at the 2040 general plan as well as the climate action plan, and then various other resources to determine what Stockton wants for themselves. So in the case of trees, for example, coupled with NGO and local support for tree planting, as well as the government's objectives, we're expected to see a 10% increase in absolute tree coverage over a 20-year adoption timeframe. And that adoption timeframe really refers to the period in which we're modeling to implement these smart surfaces. The full costs and benefits are actually quantified and analyzed an additional 10 years after, for a total of 30 years of analysis. Again, we separate low slope and steep slope, both for cool roofs and solar PV. Despite Stockton having majority residential steep, again, these are more expensive to implement and less feasible, and there's less area to actually develop or to implement the roof. So the majority of the modeling comes from low slope cool roofs and low slope solar PV. So some limitations with the study before we go any further is this is really seen as a first order estimate of Stockton's surface options in terms of what they can achieve. We don't quantify a number of different benefits, such as reduced heat deaths. For that, we could use like the value of a statistical life that the federal government uses to quantify reduced heat mortality. But a lot of these things like reduced hospital visits, increased exercise enabled by cooler, less polluted and greener outdoor spaces, and reduced crime are often really difficult to model because there's too many complexities and variables at play. So for the sake of the study being conservative, we actually intend to leave those out. So the results could be higher, but we only include what we're confident in quantifying. We also don't include a lot of the green stormwater management solutions in the Stockton analysis because Stockton gets about half the rainfall per year than the average US city. So the only green stormwater management solution that we actually model are trees, as opposed to a Baltimore study, for example, we did in July, where we looked at bioswales, porous surfaces, and other methods to slow the dispersion of water. So I think this slide is important in showing the multi-benefit approach that Smart Surfaces takes. Like I said, when a Department of Transportation or any city agency that's handling infrastructure is making those decisions, they're really only looking at lowest cost. So if you think for a cool roof, to deploy a cool roof, it has to be, cost effective compared to the traditional, dark roof made of asphalt shingles normal shingles. But there is a clear benefit, for example, for energy, for direct energy savings. A cool roof will actually reduce the amount that AC has to run, so that you're actually getting a reduced AC bill from the standpoint of a homeowner. That's a very real benefit that exists that we can quantify, that department agencies that make these infrastructure decisions don't factor in. So when you do factor in things like energy, health, and climate change, it becomes really compelling from a cost standpoint of why you should be implementing these solutions, because oftentimes these benefits are not quantified. But even on a simple dollar and cents basis, especially with reflective surfaces, so roofs, roads, and parking lots, there's a life extension benefit that's very real as well. So cool roads, for example, the dark impervious standard will actually contract and expand from the heat because it is absorbing so much of that solar radiation. Couple that with elements of water and freezing and stuff like that, this leads to cracking. So when you have a cool roof or a cool pavement, my apologies, there is a life extension benefit. It doesn't crack as much. So you're actually saving money on how often you're having to resurface and implement these surfaces in the first place. Again, another thing to note is the water benefit that we calculate is only applies to trees because that's really the only stormwater management practice we model in Stockton. But this is, I think, good in terms of, looking at the different benefits and what's not factored in traditionally. So now going into the specific surfaces and how we model them, we think about reflective surfaces in this case, like roofs, roads, and parking lots, and the very real benefits that they provide, for example, to ambient air temperature from the standpoint of roads and parking lots. So they're not actually cooling down a building, but more cooling the ambient air citywide, whereas cool roofs, for example, will actually cool the building itself and reduce the need for AC. These also have, health benefits by reducing the amount of ozone and PM 2.5 particulate matter in the atmosphere, and also global cooling benefits on top of that. And to quantify each benefit, we really work with, every benefit is related to a specific study, and you can go back to the Stockton Report and every assumption is documented in some capacity, as well as partners like the American Public Health Association or the National League of Cities are actually helping us quantify a lot of these different impacts, or they're justifying the cost and benefit assumptions that we provide. So when we do have a cost assumption, for example, if you see roofs, you see $13 million for the cost of implementing cool roofs over the 20-year span in Stockton. That was provided by a series of studies, and coupled with, we went to the Global Cool Cities Alliance, as well as the Cool Roof Rating Council. So kind of just like industry leading organizations that helped us craft and come up with a cost assumption per square foot that really makes sense and is conservative, as I said. So once you come up with a cost per square foot and a benefit square foot, like I said, it's just a matter of having those surface coverage numbers that I showed earlier in the presentation to kind of form a preliminary first order cost benefit analysis of the surface options available to Stockton. So if you see here, the roofs, roads, and parking lots kind of have different attributes that are worth mentioning. Cool roofs, you see that the MPV for steep slope roofs are actually negative. And the reason we include that is because heat-related mortality is not included in this model. Oftentimes, heat deaths occur on the top floor of buildings, and it's because of those steep slope roofs. It's the floors nearest to the steep slope roofs that actually get impacted most with heat-related mortality, and there's a variety of studies to prove that. We actually include this in here because, including the value of a statistical life saved would only increase the rationale for why these solutions are compelling. And then again, there's obviously a temperature reduction benefit associated with parking lots that's maybe greater than roads. But if you look at the proposed adoption target, it kind of makes sense. And, when you go to a bird's eye view and you're looking at all of these benefits in sum, they really start to play off each other, where you see, parking has a good temperature reduction benefit, whereas, for the next slide, for example, there's a lot of jobs created from solar, and the benefits for solar, drastically outweigh the cost in our modeling. And part of the reason that is because we assume that all solar is third-party financed, due to the reality that most of it is. But I think solar, maybe we don't need to explain for the terms of this presentation. But again, the steep slope versus low slope difference in targets is really to reflect the cost of implementation, but also the lack of available surface options where solar could realistically be implemented. So you see that reflective surfaces in solar are kind of keen at managing sunlight. The urban trees are really good at managing both. So they do sequester carbon and catch particulate matter, while also providing stormwater runoff benefits. And the temperature reduction number is pretty significant because trees provide radiative shading, but also the effect of evapotranspiration causes cooling. This 1.1 degree Fahrenheit reduction from increasing the tree canopy by roughly 10% is only from radiative shading. We do not include the effect of evapotranspiration. Again, just going to show that this modeling is conservative and that the benefits would likely be greater. We also found that with trees specifically, that around a 1% increase in absolute tree canopy can lead to a 0.11 degree Fahrenheit reduction in peak summer temperatures. So 10% will lead to a 1.1 degree Fahrenheit. Again, that is kind of derived from leading modeling from organizations like Altostratus and Kappa Strategies, but also a variety of other studies and partner support that I mentioned. So, looking at all of the services again, you really kind of see what value each one's bring in terms of, the different benefits that they provide. So trees, for example, provide a lot of temperature reduction, as does cool roofs. And cool roofs are a really good option. But people might say, reflective parking and roads, the benefit cost ratio is good, but it's not something like solar where I need to be doing this all the time. But again, it does have a significant benefit cost ratio. It does lead to temperature reductions, specifically on, the indirect level. So ambient reductions for reflective roads and parkings, but also that reduction that improvement in life extension for these surfaces is really important to mention. Cities not having to repave roads for, an additional 10 years is really, really important, but also compelling from a city budget standpoint. So this is just kind of to present it in a cleaner way, and just kind of looking at all of the different benefits that we summarize in the report. I will note that the 4.58 million tons carbon emissions reduction does get derived from specifically 4 different areas. So one is solar PV will offset the amount of dirty energy that's being emitted. Another is carbon sequestration from trees, in which we use the iTree planting calculator. And iTree is great, and we use a lot of the tools in these reports as well. We also include a citywide reduction in AC usage as a result of decreased heat. And then we also model increased reflectivity. So in Stockton, for example, with an average albedo or measure of reflectivity that solar radiation is actually being reflected is about 0.16 citywide, meaning that 16% is actually being reflected back. Whereas when you change the overall albedo with reflective surfaces like roofs, roads, and parking lots, that contributes significantly to a reduction in AC, but also resulting carbon emissions. So what does this demonstrate for California? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but essentially California is a leader, and I think there's no denying that, and kind of all things climate, if you will. So Smart Surfaces isn't going to like rewrite the path of California, but more so enable them to meet their climate targets on time, enable them to address, public health, equity, tourism, grid reliance, air quality, not just in siloed strategies anymore, but in this whole integrated strategy that can do so very cost effectively when scaled up, but also provide a lot of unquantified benefits to people's lives that actually have a real impact that are maybe not being factored in right now. So before I get started on the let me just pause share for a second. Before I get started on the finding the money aspect of the presentation, I want to show everyone the cost benefit analytic engine. So here we go. So this tool was essentially made with the report that we did for Stockton. And it allows Stockton to optimize the different surface interventions and different strategies to make sure that they are meeting their goals on on air quality and heat and flooding and stuff like that. So this tool is kind of, it's very iterative, easy to use. And I'll kind of walk through the steps to show you the functionality of it. But, first you would select a location. In the case of Stockton, we already know the location. This tool was specifically designed for Stockton. So these city area population tree cover numbers have been, pre-populated. But if you were a city that, maybe is near Stockton, you want to use the same impact data, you can actually go into the customized surface area option drop down menu and change the actual square footage of things like commercial low slope, residential steep slope roofs, parking, streets, etc., allowing the city to to update this information also. So after you choose a location, you choose the time period in which smart services will be implemented. As I said, when you pick 20 years, that's the cost of adoption over 20 years. We are actually measuring and quantifying the costs and benefits an additional 10 years after. So it'd be a total of 30 years. If you selected 30 years, we would be analyzing adoption over a 40-year time frame. So for the report, we actually do 20, so we'll stick with that. And then at this point, we go into the specific interventions themselves and dictate which surface options Stockton really wants for itself. So they come with these pre-selected panels. This first selection is roofing, by the way. So we model 4 different kinds of roofing in the tool: cool roofs with rainwater harvesting, green roofs, and then PV. Again, that PV is third-party financed. Once, say Stockton wants 15% cool roofs instead of whatever the number I have here is, you can actually play with the numbers and kind of determine what an adoption scenario that works for the city is. And to change the specific breakdown of low slope to steep slope, you can actually go in and do that as well by clicking this button here. So again, playing with the numbers to kind of optimize the best strategy for Stockton's roofing options. We'll leave all the other presets the same as I think it demonstrates the functionality. So the next section is parking lots. Again, I'll just hit moderate to show, but we modeled 2 types of parking lots. This are reflective parking, so it has a reflective surface coating over it, but also permeable parking. And again, you can go in and play with the numbers and determine what the best strategy is. So lastly, we go to streets and sidewalks. We actually don't model reflective sidewalks over concerns of pedestrian comfort and glare, but we'll keep reflective streets in here. And we also model permeable sidewalks, but again, not in Stockton because a lot of those green stormwater management solutions were not looked at due to the nature of Stockton's flooding mainly being caused by waterway overflow as opposed to, say, rainfall that's being trapped in impervious surfaces or leading to runoff. So the last section is trees. Again, pretty self-explanatory, but whatever the tree goal for your city is, you can adjust accordingly. For the report, we put 20, so a 10% absolute increase. And then once you're done with all of the solutions that you want to model, you hit calculate, and it'll come up with a complete breakdown of all of the costs and benefits. You see the costs here in red and the benefits in black. The tool is currently being worked on right now to update some of these numbers. So, for the sake of looking at the actual number values themselves, I would avoid that because it is being worked on. For example, things like the stormwater retention value are going to get reduced a little bit, but just to reflect, new studies that we read, recent discussions with our partners. And at the bottom here, you can actually select the different surface option and see the benefits that accrue. So for green roofs, you could see a stormwater retention value, reduced ozone value, et cetera, while also giving you an overarching net present value, benefit cost ratio, and temperature reduction associated with these interventions. Cool. So in terms of the tool, that's good. But yeah, the tool is currently in beta right now, meaning that when we do work with a city, we can make one for the city. but it's not publicly available yet because a lot of the kinks are still being worked out. But it has undergone test processes and gotten some really positive feedback. So, this part of the presentation, I'd like to find the money, as Dennis says, and this is really just looking at two, specific areas. One, money in the federal government, specifically from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as elsewhere, like agencies such as FEMA or HUD, as well as some policies within California themselves, and we'll explain those as well. So all of this will be in the document in the tiny URL that Dennis mentioned earlier. So if you don't catch something, no worries. It will be in that document. But in terms of just highlighting a couple key points, these are, federally funded grant programs or, other policies that we think could encourage the adoption of smart surfaces. And when I say that, that's really measures to integrate this multi-benefit approach, and to integrate multiple different, interventions like trees, like solar, like reflective roofs or pavements, kind of all tackling different issues, but simultaneously. So I think the best program in terms of summing that up is the Healthy Streets program. It's about $500 million in funding over the 4-year span that came right out of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That specifically provides grants for low-income communities to deploy reflective and porous pavements, but also expand tree cover. So, you really start to see that approach not only of, heat and flooding is an issue. Now heat and flooding and equity and health are now all issues that the city is kind of fighting simultaneously. And a smart services strategy would be really effective at addressing that. So again, feel free to peruse these, but there is what we found in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act in particular, as with California, is that a lot of these are siloed approaches to, urban heat, a tree planting program, or a reflective street, or something like that. But what the Healthy Streets programs and some of these other programs show is that by integrating these solutions, we don't have to look at challenges one-dimensionally anymore. We can look at them, on a citywide scale and address them in an integrated fashion. So breaking apart from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, these are kind of other federally focused funding opportunities. I'll note the Storm and Brick Act or program really are with FEMA. But again, taking I call it an emergency perspective on smart surfaces. When you think about the people's lives that are at risk from extreme heat days, from flooding incidences that cause mold and associated childhood development and cognitive issues, it really becomes an emergency. So oftentimes to deploy some of these green stormwater management as well as heat reduction strategies, FEMA might be a good place to start. But again, the Community Development Block Grant Program, and again, going into that kind of emergency perspective with the CDBG-DR, really is just a kind of a typical way for localities to fund solutions like this. But yeah, that I think wraps up federally the programs of focus. Again, these will be in the follow-up document. Now focusing in specifically on California, some of these aren't funding opportunities necessarily, but more so policies to focus on. So I bring up the solar roof mandate, not because it's going to, provide funding for these wide-scale strategies to be implemented, but more so show that if solar is being implemented in every new building or every newly constructed home in California, meeting, the mandate, then there is no reason that we shouldn't be adopting co-strategies to increase the efficiency of these panels or to reduce the cost of implementation. And when you think of strategies like cool roofs and cool roads, these are those co-strategies that are effective in doing so. And Dennis brought up agrivoltaics before. When you put a PV system in a green roof, again, cost of implementation goes down and the roof life actually gets extended because the greenery serves as a ballast to hold up the solar panel, and it actually increases the efficiency of the panel as well due to greenery being lighter in nature. And then the kind of two programs I want to focus on are the Transformative Climate Communities Program and the Urban Flood Protection Grant Program. The grant program has already been awarded, so not necessarily a new funding opportunity, but again, just an example of a policy that shows how we can, engage not just one solution at a time, but to include things like trees and permeable surfaces in the same program. And then lastly, I'll touch on the Extreme Heat Action Plan and Draft, which the Smart Surfaces Coalition contributed to the draft process of that plan by doing the things that we discussed in this presentation, advocating for multi-benefit analysis and to perforate silos in California to really have city agencies work together to address heat, not in a one-off solution, but as a holistic solution. So that is my presentation. Here are some resources that can be made available as well, and happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Jackson. Yeah, very good presentation. And let me just get get the video going again. And okay. So let's see, stop video. There we go. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'll pull from the Q&A, which has been pretty active. But first, I do want to do a little bit of recognitions. I wanted, first and foremost, I wanted to recognize Ann Schneider, the mayor of Millbrae, who contributed a lot to the Q&A, and we'll get into that in just a second. And also Diana Reddy, Vice Mayor of Redwood City. And I believe, I'm not sure if she's on at this second, but Pat Showalter, who's a multi-time mayor and current city council member of Mountain View. So as far as the questions, I'll go kind of chronologically. So Mayor Schneider actually kind of talked a little bit about federal and state funding and the direct funding to cities of all sizes. She is, Millbrae is a smaller, I'll just read what she said. Much federal and state funding goes to big cities and those in the 50,000 to big city size directly, but cities below 50,000, which includes Millbrae, do not get direct funding. Instead, funding goes to state, regional, and sub-regional entities who then make small cities go through the competitive grant process and the politics associated with that. She speaks basically of the inequity in the sub 50,000 city category. Also that the per capita allocation is smaller too. So she talks about a double inequity. Any comments on that in terms of city size within a federal and state scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And it's certainly something that we recognize. I will say, though, that the coalition's narrow focus is really kind of this cost benefit analysis of looking at different surfaces. And while we can point to, example policies that might engage a more holistic strategy, we don't necessarily have the bandwidth to help local cities, engage in like grant making applications, or for localities that are smaller to be fairly represented in this grant process. It is something that, a partner of ours, the National League of Cities, I'm sure helps with. But and I do understand like it is a double inequity, and there should be policies that address this accordingly. But it is not in our narrow focus. So apologies for not answering the question, but it is a good point you bring up for sure.
Yes, and that is actually too something I've taken a note. For future. There's going to be new congressional leadership with the retirement of Jackie Spear, and although I'm really looking forward to her as a really storied congressperson and actually a major player in terms of state government to consult on these kinds of issues as well. So another question came up, actually a bit more of a point question. For residential use on roofs, what is and actually for roads, do you have information about like best paints? I'm assuming on the roof issue that's more like a flat roof that would be painted, and perhaps if there are links to that. So thoughts on paints for roofs and roads?
Yeah, so I don't know if I have a specific answer on like the best paint to use. I know that like we do have an analysis of the different, I guess, like reflective coating options that you can put on roofs or on like parking lots and streets. And then if you do go to the Cool Roof Rating Council, and I'll drop their link in the chat. But they do have a Cool Roof directory where you can actually go in and pick the best roof option that is available to your local climate reality. Oop.
And
Yeah, I'll just put in the general chat right now.
okay, and I was thinking that perhaps Greg Spots might have some opinions on that
Yeah, he would as well.
well. And a bit of a plug for the wet talk we had with Greg Katz and Greg Spots. There was a lot of that video is I put the link in chat for that as well. A lot of time because I think it was the most novel so cooling solution. A lot of time was spent on cool roads and coatings to surface streets. He memorably showed satellite images of Los Angeles, both at like middle of the day, 3 o'clock and maybe 9 o'clock at night. And it looked, you could definitely tell the surface streets in Los Angeles from satellite at 9 o'clock at night. They retain the heat and it's very visible. Also, a kind of just a follow-up question to that about these paints. Are they listed in the universal building codes?
I don't think so. I know California does have a cool roof mandate that requires an SRI threshold in certain areas. Like for example, a threshold outside of LA might be like a 0.17. But when you think about the average albedo of a city being 0.16, these minimum thresholds in the building code and different policies are probably not enough to lead to substantial change. But in terms of if they're in the building code, I'm not sure about that.
You mentioned SRI, a little
Yes.
acronym alert. Can you?
Oh yeah. So SRI is essentially a measure of reflectivity and thermal emissivity. So it's the rate at which or the ability of a material to reflect light or reflect heat and then actually store and release heat.
So it's an albedo measurement then.
Yes.
Okay. Word for
Essentially,
today, everyone, albedo.
yeah, exactly.
Unfortunately, that doesn't qualify for Wordle. So, okay. Uh, Rory Cox from the PUC had mentioned, a couple things. One was you covered it briefly, the CEC solar mandate for new construction, and that is kind of working its way through to building codes and, as well. But also, he mentioned in the proposed budget, $2 billion for climate resiliency,
Hmm.
and I guess we'll have to see how that gets divvied up, because that's actually a pretty big bucket, or whatever's bigger than a bucket, a trough, that for funding as well. But I just wondered if you had any comments on the proposed California budget, which
Yeah,
had
I
a
mean
fair
the
amount of good features in it.
yeah, I agree. And to a certain extent, like things like this, like 2 million for climate resiliency, can be broad, and we're like Dennis said, we're gonna have to wait and see how that actually gets allocated. But more generally, I do think that there was a lot more focus on integrated strategies than in the past, and especially with the extreme heat action plan draft webinar process. I heard a lot of discussion about not just one solution at a time anymore, but multiple to address multiple different challenges.
Yes, I've been kidding about the Nobel Prize for economics going to key research work in terms of multi-benefit economics, and really getting into that thinking.
Yeah.
And and your shortlist as well, and the idea of integrated solutions. I mean, makes a ton of sense, but it also flies in the face of not my budget.
Yeah. Oh, I totally get that. There are a lot of benefits that do accrue, to the city themselves outside of, what gets accrued to specific neighborhoods or homeowners. An example would be, property values increasing due to reduced loss of, or expected loss of tourism, not reducing, as well as, increased livability, cooler temperatures in the summer, employment benefits that increase the tax base. There are benefits that do accrue to the city. In our next report, we actually are going to focus on, specifically which benefits accrue to who. So if a city had X amount of money in their budget, they could realistically do something like this. And that's just kind of the next step in our analysis.
Yes, another comment from Mayor Schneider. I guess that she had a discussion with her city manager
Nice.
of reflective materials, about the application of reflective materials, and he asked if they are in the Universal Building Code. So and she says, if a city doesn't have its own special code section, we rely on the UBC, and there are other kind of model codes. I think I would submit that well, there's always the issue about prescription, and to what extent codes consider things. I think this may even be at the in terms of reflective materials, might be almost ahead of code cycles. Code cycles are typically 3-year, seem like glacial kind of things, but in terms of adoptions and things, I don't know offhand about even specific categories for instance, cool roads or reflective materials. And then, of course, in building codes, I mean, it affects mostly buildings. I do think, actually, what's really interesting is this, and this might be a more voluntary kind of issue, but parking lots are huge surfaces, and I know you're showing some of the cost benefit of that, but cool parking lots seem like a real interesting thing for the expanse that they usually take.
Yeah, and cool parking has a slightly different reality than cool streets do, because cool streets are constantly getting driven and walking on. In the case of parking lots, you do just have cars parked there, so the maintenance is actually less frequent in parking lots.
Mm-hmm.
Thus making it a little more cost effective. And they're you know you can couple that with bioswale, or like tree trenches along the outside of parking lots, which can be really effective. But also in terms of like porous parking, which is, I said, not mentioned in Stockton or this report, can also reduce the use of salt, and studies have shown that to be true. So just another benefit that could accrue to the city, in that they don't have to lay salt as much with these porous surfaces.
Yeah, and then of course with the localization, now that might be salt lane is not usually a big thing as far as at least coastal California.
Yeah.
Perhaps more mountain particular areas that in Northern California that get snow. But yeah, that's a great point. I'm very familiar with the roads getting salted around the country, but that seems a little bit less of an issue here.
Yeah.
Another question from Vice Mayor Reddy of Redwood City, about equity issues. In addition to cost-benefit analysis, are points, well, I guess within the model, are points given to cities that can demonstrate communities of need? So is there, well, I don't know if there's a specific equity aspect of this, but after your thoughts on this, I do want a second about the Cal Enviro screen.
Yeah, for sure. So equity is not something we quantify in terms of dollar per square foot, but we do recognize the benefit of smart surfaces in addressing equity. So before, or when we're working with the city, one of the first things we will propose is to hone down on select low income neighborhoods in particular, to show the specific benefits and costs that accrue to these neighborhoods. So in the case of Baltimore that I mentioned, we did an analysis back in July. We selected 3 low income neighborhoods that had tree coverage on the order of around 5 and 6% compared to the city average of 40. A drastic underinvestment in terms of green space, and just more densely populated, or dense, dark roofs and dark streets kind of dominated these areas. So before we work in a city, we do, in a way, equity assess and map, to see these communities of needs. But when you are doing anything on a citywide scale, and in the specific case of greenery and smart surfaces, the largest benefits will accrue in low income neighborhoods, because these are just the neighborhoods that have more dark and impervious surfaces, that have less tree coverage, that have been often historically redlined, and face other challenges. So in terms of points and assigning a dollar per square foot, not necessarily, but we do recognize the benefits.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like it's a natural,
Yeah.
if not overt, kind of an equity component. There's a natural equity component in terms of like bang for the buck in terms of investment and the results
Yeah.
that you get. And actually, the tree distribution is that I've seen a lot of studies about that in terms of relative neighborhood wealth and tree canopy, and so I think addressing that is a real great thing as well. I did just want a quick mention locally here about Cal Enviro screen, which is very tied with, it's basically mapping, of equity and identifying, I think at the census district level, areas of need. I think it's a great tool. It's something that gets relied on funding, state funding. although it doesn't treat the Bay Area very well. And I've had some conversations with Cal EPA about it. But it's something we need to dig in deeper. So I'm just mentioning that as a future brown bag. At the very least, I want the Cal Enviro screen people, they're up to version 4.0, to go through their methodology and convince us that it's a very good thing that can assess different regions fairly. The So again, a couple more questions or actually some comments. Again, with Mayor Schneider about legislation. Just kind of different takes on legislation, and actually she alludes to code specific kind of almost advocacy campaigns like that have been involved in codes. He mentions the plastic bag bans, which occurred city by city, and then perhaps the most famous story has been that the codes, the electric building codes, the building reach codes, because I think we're up to 55 cities in California that have adopted reach codes on top of the kind of state minimum building codes that calling for all electric new construction, and even getting into retrofits, as far as electric things. I mean, which is among other things, a great thing for indoor air pollution. A mention here from Jeremy Sigmund, from an ex-USGBC staffer, and asking about other parts of the world that lead on smart surfaces. What is the worldview like?
Yeah, so a great question, and we're just starting to delve and expand internationally. So obviously, the Nordic countries are going to have a lot of really innovative solar applications. So solar facades are a big thing in like Norway and Sweden. These are just like vertical cool solutions, or solar PV solutions, such as like a solar wall or a cool wall. I will also note that the Cool Roof Rating Council does now rate walls, so that's starting to expand to the U.S. as well. But in the U.S., I mean, Phoenix and LA are kind of really the leaders in reflectivity, and for
They have to be.
for rightful reason, yeah, exactly. But I would also maybe look at Singapore has some really interesting examples of vertically integrating greenery. Obviously Singapore has a lot of different space issues, and that's the reason why they're maybe building up rather than out. But in doing so, they have to manage their surfaces, smarter, to affect things like heat and rain. So they'd also be an interesting case study to look at. And then most recently, we're actually looking in India, not necessarily because a lot of smart services are implemented there, but that's also where like a lot of the opportunity is. So when you have these rapidly growing cities like in sub-Saharan Africa, South America, or Asia, in particular India, the opportunity for smart services is really excellent, because so many people are going to be moving there, and the city's going to have to just keep expanding and expanding and expanding. In order to expand smartly, you need to avoid surfaces that are dark and impervious. And this is kind of the only strategy that can do so in these developing countries cost effectively, so that they don't have to resurface all the time or implement new roofs all the time.
Yeah, I just put in the chat an article that I had open about cool roofs in
Oh,
India,
nice.
and what a benefit it is, especially workers, that are doing work at home, are suddenly much more productive if you can knock a few degrees off their roofs. We are in overtime as promised, and just a couple points that in the Q&A from Mayor Schneider and commenting on actually, I think we hit a nerve with the Cal Enviro screen, and we'll look to focus on that because she mentions Millbrae and how Millbrae is evaluated. It has a lot of issues with particulate matter. I mean, they're right next to the airport and right next to major highway 101, and there's even noise effects and everything as well. And they're a main transportation corridor. I mean, with BART and Caltrain kind of there with the airport. So even with a majority minority or a minority majority city, they don't. The property values are fairly high, so they don't sit well on the screen. Again, that we'll need your counterpart on EnviroScreen to get involved in that. And she also mentions the San Mateo County Office of Sustainability, and they are working on a heat island study with wind factors, and that affects a lot of like tree planting. Apparently that study isn't out yet, and
Oh, I was going to say, is it out? Okay. Yeah,
yeah.
interesting. Curious.
Again, other areas to kind of investigate. And then of course, and she mentions as well the brown bag on EnviroScreen, and calls out Mayor Romero from East Palo Alto, who apparently has been working on this issue. So that's good to know as well. We tried to get invitations out to everyone, especially all the electeds and staff around the Bay Area. We sent out thousands of invites. So you should hear from us a lot more on these things. So unless there's any other questions, if I'll just keep an eye out for that. But otherwise, do you have any final thoughts, Mr. Becce?
I don't think so. I mean, if the presentation will be uploaded, my email is at the end of the presentation. Feel free to email me if you have any questions related to the report or any other analysis the coalition has done, or more broadly about how smart services can apply to your specific jurisdiction and constituent pool. So happy to help in any way.
Yes, there will be an edited video out, lightly edited, a video out as soon as possible, at least by early next week. And as I mentioned, I will include, since there's so many links on this, I'll try to put a document together that has the chat and the Q&A, and we'll have that also to the people that registered, but also to on social media as well, and on all the things like YouTube and our website and as well. So anyway, Jackson, I really appreciate this. I think it was a really the Smart Surfaces discussion was not exhausted with the wet talk. I mean, it was pretty obvious that we really needed to get into the weeds and really start looking at a lot of the methodology and all the things that you are looking at. And also, we want to keep an eye on the analysis tools that you're working on, and when they are ready for prime time, we'll definitely have a campaign about that as well. as a campaign on all these other issues that we've uncovered here. So I just want to remind everybody to be like water. The drought is, I don't know, part 6 drought. And there's been a lot of news about drought and lately, and none of it's been good. So with that, I'd like to wish everyone a happy weekend, happy Friday, and thanks once again.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, everyone.